The consensus narrative on great power conflict is a strategic misdirection. Media saturation focuses on hypersonic missiles and carrier groups, visible, expensive, kinetic assets. This is a fundamental misreading of the battle space. The initial vector of a 21st century systemic conflict will not be a launch sequence. It will be absolute engineered silence. Analysts at RUSI and CSIS have modeled this exact scenario. The primary targets are not cities. They are two categories of infrastructure that constitute the central nervous system of the Western order. First, the undersea fiber optic cables. These are the physical arteries of global finance and data, transmitting 99% of all intercontinental traffic. They are a publicly mapped, functionally undefended systemic liability. The second vector is orbital denial. Not the costly, easily attributable kinetic destruction of satellites, but temporary, non-destructive blinding. Ground-based lasers targeting the imaging and transmission sensors of low Earth orbit constellations can neutralize GPS, intelligence gathering, and high-frequency trading communications for critical windows of time. The objective is not destruction, it is paralysis. When you sever the data cables and blind the orbital assets, you do not create a wounded hegemon. You create a blind Leviathan. It possesses the full weight of its kinetic military power, but it is disconnected from the global financial system it commands. It cannot see threats, coordinate forces, or clear a single dollar-denominated transaction. The mechanism of its power, instantaneous digital settlement, is nullified. A hegemon facing a systemic solvency crisis and sensory deprivation does not negotiate. Its response function simplifies. When asymmetric attacks nullify economic leverage and internal systems begin to cascade into failure, the kinetic cost-benefit analysis inverts. The threshold for deploying overwhelming military force as the final instrument of control does not decrease. It approaches mathematical certainty. This is not a possibility. It is a protocol. The pivot to asymmetric warfare is not a strategic preference. It is a function of state insolvency. When a nation's ability to fund a conventional kinetic war collapses, it does not surrender. It recalibrates its vectors of attack to inflict maximum economic damage at minimum cost. This isn't a choice. It is a mathematical imperative driven by weakness. Consider the Russian Federation. Analysts at RUSI have documented how its protracted kinetic campaign became a catastrophic domestic liability. The war is not just unpopular, it is a systemic drain consuming the state's fiscal and political capital. This is the blueprint for a national solvency crisis. When the cost of projecting power abroad exceeds the state's ability to maintain stability at home. A state facing insolvency cannot compete symmetrically against a hegemon. It cannot afford the launch-on-warning posture, the carrier groups, the satellite networks. The kinetic cost is simply too high. Its only rational move is to find an asymmetric lever, a vector where a $1,000 investment can inflict a $1 billion liability on the target. This is why state-sponsored actors like the Muddy Water APT are not peripheral threats. They are the advance force. As documented by CloudCK, their probing of critical infrastructure in the Middle East using new rust-based implants is a live fire drill. They are mapping the systemic choke points of Western finance, energy, and logistics. The motive is irrefutable. It is a zero-sum play for survival. By triggering a solvency crisis within the United States, paralyzing its economy through asymmetric means, an adversary nullifies the hegemon's primary source of power. They cannot win a symmetric war, so they are changing the battlefield to one of systemic liquidity. Their weakness forces them to make our stability their primary target. The calculus of warfare has inverted. Analysts at the Royal United Services Institute, ARUSI, document the new battlefield equation. A $5 million main battle tank can be neutralized by a $500 drone. This is not an anecdotal observation. It is a structural shift in the economics of lethality. The cost-per-kill ratio has collapsed, and with it, the entire framework of conventional deterrence. This extreme cost asymmetry enables what strategists call the democratization of violence. The barrier to entry for projecting lethal state-level force has been lowered from billions of dollars in industrial capacity to the cost of consumer electronics. A nation-state no longer needs a symmetric navy or air force to challenge a hegemon. It merely needs to fund the vectors of asymmetric attack. These vectors are not just physical drones. State-sponsored, advanced, persistent threats, such as muddy water, are the digital equivalent. Their objective is not to seize territory, but to trigger a systemic solvency crisis by attacking the soft underbelly of the West: finance, energy, and logistics. The kinetic cost is near zero. The potential economic damage is exponential. When a superpower's primary economic leverage is systemically nullified by low-cost, asymmetric attacks, its response protocol is forced to simplify. The political debate over intervention becomes irrelevant. When faced with an internal cascade failure, the deployment of kinetic military power as the final instrument of control moves from a policy option to a mathematical certainty. It becomes a launch-on-warning scenario for total economic collapse. The regional instability vectors are not random noise. They are laboratories. What the media portrays as localized chaos in places like South Africa is, in fact, a controlled gray zone, a live fire testing environment for the asymmetric economic warfare that is coming. These are not the crisis. They are the rehearsals for the crisis. Analysts at CSIS have issued warnings, buried in sector-specific bulletins, of threat actors stress-testing logistical and energy choke points in Western-aligned but second-tier economies. These are not probes. They are calibration runs to measure the precise input required to trigger a systemic cascade failure with maximum kinetic and economic cost. This is not theoretical. According to industrial cyber intelligence, state-sponsored vectors like the Muddy Water, APT, are already deploying advanced Rust-based implants against critical infrastructure in the Middle East. They are perfecting the weaponry and doctrine in real time, sharpening the digital spear that will be aimed at the core financial and energy grids of the West. These proxy zones are selected with surgical precision. They possess sufficient integration with Western systems to provide meaningful data, but lack the robust defensive architecture of a primary target. They are the perfect launchpad to test attack efficacy, observe response protocols, and map the path of least resistance for a systemic solvency event targeting the US dollar itself. The response is not symmetric. It is a pivot to asymmetric escalation. The goal is to nullify the hegemon's economic leverage by triggering an internal cascade failure. While the West prepares for a trade war, adversaries are preparing for a solvency war. The timeline is already being priced in. As Russian intelligence-adjacent sources show, certain logistics and defense assets, like Suns Inc., are projected to return to pre-crisis levels by July 2025. This isn't a prediction. It's a balance sheet. The bedrock of nuclear deterrence is not the warhead, it is the data. The launch-on-warning doctrine is a systemic protocol dictated by time and physics. Once an inbound kinetic strike is detected, a retaliatory launch must be executed before those assets are neutralized. There is no time for committee meetings. This creates a systemic vulnerability. According to a CSIS assessment, an adversary does not need to win a symmetric conflict. They only need to introduce ambiguity into the data stream. This is the fog of digital war, a cyber vector delivered by a state-sponsored actor that blinds early warning radar or corrupts satellite intelligence forces the commander into a zero-sum calculation. Is the data loss a malfunction, or is it the prelude to a decapitation strike? The protocol allows no room for optimism. The risk of inaction, the total loss of second strike capability, is mathematically greater than the risk of launching on a false positive. When the screen goes black, fear is irrelevant. The launch sequence is triggered by the logic of the machine. The mathematical linkage between the U.S. trade deficit and its national security is severed. For 50 years, the dollar recycling protocol forced adversaries to finance American debt as a precondition for market access. The intentional collapse of this deficit, presented as a victory, is in fact the deliberate removal of their primary incentive for compliance. The response vector is not symmetric trade war, it is asymmetric escalation. Analysts at CSIS confirm that state-sponsored vectors, like the Muddy Water APT, are not merely practicing on Middle East infrastructure. They are refining attack protocols against the West's critical dependencies: finance, energy, logistics. The objective is not destruction but strategic paralysis, triggering a systemic solvency crisis that cannot be traced to a state actor. Expect a calibration shot within the next 12 months. This is an attack designed to be indistinguishable from systemic failure. Its purpose is to test the fragility of the U.S. system and its political response threshold, all under the cover of plausible deniability. The target will be a logistical choke point. The specific event will be a cascading logistics failure at a major West Coast port. A corrupted software update in the container management system will trigger a multi-day shutdown. It will be publicly attributed to a systems integration error exacerbated by delays similar to those seen during past government shutdowns. Billions in economic damage will be calculated. The signal, however, will have been sent.